Welcome to the Westport Library. Today's program will begin momentarily. Supported by Verso Studios, created locally and shared with the world.
Good evening, everyone. Hello, welcome to the Westport Library. I'm Jennifer Keller. I'm part of the programming team and part of the committee for Westport Reads. So I doubly welcome you this evening. This evening's event is part of Westport Reads, celebration of Firekeeper's daughter. We hope that you will also attend the keynote event next Thursday, February 16th, when Angeline Booley will be here on this stage to discuss her novel and answer your questions. Tonight, however, we are proud to have Silvermoon LaRose, the Assistant Director of the Tomaquag Museum in Rhode Island, to help us better understand the native culture of the tribe in the Firekeeper's daughter and those from our part of the country. She is a member of the Narragansett tribe and has worked in tribal communities for more than 20 years, serving in the areas of health and human services and education. At the museum, she assists with managing the museum's collection and archives, cultural education, and the Indigenous empowerment projects. Silvermoon also serves as the secretary for the Charlestown Conservation Commission, and as an artist and educator, she hopes to foster Indigenous empowerment through education, community building, and the sharing of cultural knowledge and traditional arts, which is why she's here this evening. So please help me welcome Silvermoon LaRose.
Tabatniana Wayan, thank you. Oh goodness, it's always awkward to get up and stand up here and have to feel all official, especially when it's a big stage like this. This really should feel comfortable. We should really be in a space of sharing and having conversation together around this beautiful book. Books are, oh, I can take this off now that I'm up here. Books are not a written record. Books hold our stories. They are a physical embodiment of thoughts and memories, feelings and emotions, our hopes and dreams. A land acknowledgement is a type of story. It's a story that acknowledges the place, the history of that place, the original inhabitants of that place, what has happened, what is still going on. We are telling the story of a living people in their survivance. Despite colonization, despite genocide, despite enslavement, despite removal and displacement, despite assimilation attempts, the Indigenous people are still here. So tonight I wish to pay my respects to my Paugussett and Schaghticoke relatives on whose homelands we are guests tonight, myself included. A land acknowledgement is a story. It is the beginning of a story that is still being written. It's a countermeasure to the erasure of Indigenous people, and this is your call to action in this story. This is a story that I'm now passing on to you to finish. So what's going to happen next? What will be done? How do you want this story to end, and what role will you play in that story? That is really where our mind should be when we hear a land acknowledgement. What are we going to do? What are we going to create in this world that builds more spaces for Indigenous people, supports the sovereignty of Indigenous tribes, and how can we make that happen? The rest of this, I had the privilege of meeting Angeline last year when she came to Rhode Island for Read Across Rhode Island, and we got to host her at Tomaquag Museum. And at one of the events when she came to Salve Regina, I got to do a land acknowledgement there, and I shared the following, and I wanted to share this today because this is what I think of when I think of what this book means to me. When Angeline Booley wrote in my book, and she signed my book, she graciously wrote, "Stories are sacred. limitless and timeless. I thought, ooh, that's so great. Like, I want to come up with something so lovely and brilliant when I sign my books one day. Stories are medicine. They heal us, they feed the mind, touch the heart, connect to the soul. If stories are sacred medicine, then authors are healers. And that is how I see Angeline. Her book is medicine, and she is a healer. Representation matters, and to open a book and see yourself on a page and feel connected, included, understood, the main character. Representation shows us that our stories have worth, that we have worth. And when we are able to share these stories with others, it opens up dialogue, it fosters understanding, builds allies, and creates change. Angeline is truly an auntie, in all the Indigenous sense of that word. Like Donis's aunt, Teddy Firekeeper in the story, aunties are strong, they're protectors, they're promoters, they're enforcers sometimes, and we love our aunties. Seeing her, this strong Indigenous woman, glowing in all of the success of her literary work, she's protecting our stories. She's promoting our voices. She's enforcing our teachings. Representation matters, and she is the encouragement that we need to see as Indigenous people, to show us that our dreams are attainable and that there is a need and a place for our stories in this world. And that is what this book means to me. Does it make you want to read it? With that little caveat, as we break into a discussion. Now, this book takes place Sault Ste. Marie. This is very far from our homelands here. The Anishinaabe feature in this book. Now, I'm not going to go deep into Anishinaabe culture. That would be incorrect of me. I am not an Anishinaabe woman, so I have no right to speak on their teachings. I will recommend a wonderful presentation that we were able to host last year at Tomaquag Museum with a cultural educator and linguist. His name is James Vukolich, and he shared with us a lot of Ojibwe teachings. You can go on our website or just go to our YouTube page, and you can see that presentation there. He speaks to the 7-generation teachings and a lot of language learning in that. And it was perfect for understanding more in depth the culture of their community in this book. So I will let him speak for his community, and you can go there and watch that yourself for more in depth about that community. What I'm going to focus on is when I read this book, I felt represented. I saw a lot of threads of topics and areas that I live with every day that speak to me. You're reading it and you're like, oh my gosh, been there, saw that, had that conversation, that's going on in my community too. There are a lot of themes that run through this book that I think as Indigenous people of many diverse communities, we all connected with. And that's where I'm gonna focus on. So the visuals are so you didn't have to stare at me the whole time. But really, they are meant to introduce these topic areas. So disclaimers already for any photos I may or may not have borrowed off the internet. This one included, and I wanted to start by saying experiences vary. So as much as I will share stories and connections to some of these topic areas, I cannot speak for all Indigenous people. I cannot speak for all Indigenous communities, not even my own as a Narragansett woman. Our experiences vary across nations, as you see many flags of many nations represented in just this photograph. There's over 570 federally recognized tribes. There's a number more state recognized and those that are historic tribes that are not recognized by state or federal government, but are still living communities. So there are many nations with many different experiences. So we cannot obviously speak for all of those. And even within those tribal communities, there are smaller communities, groups of people, where you live, where you grow up. in your community. If you are close to your reservation, if you are well connected, or if you are urban and have Native Indian centers that are more diverse of cultures, we're gonna have different experiences and different connections to these themes. Even as individuals and the way our own lives play out in our own stories, it's going to vary. So there are so many unique stories. So everything that we talk about, you always have to remember it's not the same for everybody. Firekeeper roles. Let's start right off with the title of this book, The Firekeeper. So what I did, a little helpful for finding things that I want to talk about, I put page numbers up there, which are where these pieces come from in this story. If you want to follow along, you can certainly bring out your book, and I got all my tags in here to hopefully help me be a little bit quicker and finding things. This feels very much like church. Turn your pages to page 99. And in this part of the book, she explains firekeepers in her community. And where are we at? Firekeepers strike the fire for ceremonies, funerals, sweat lodges, and other cultural events where our prayers are carried by the smoke to Creator. A ceremonial fire is special. You don't roast marshmallows or sing 49ers songs at it. Firekeepers ensure that protocols are followed the entire time it burns. No politics, no drinking, no gossip, only good thoughts to feed the fire and carry our prayers. When I think of firekeepers in our community, we see them at different cultural events. In our communities of the Southern New England region, when we have our powwows, our gatherings, they are still very much connected to our ceremonies in our region. The largest time of year here for our community powwows would be in the summertime, August. They start going off one after the other in our area. And one thing that's different here that isn't in other tribal communities as you travel out west and elsewhere, where we dance, we actually have a ceremonial fire in the center that we dance around. It's not common to see in other tribal communities. My husband comes from way out west and he was like, why is there a fire in the middle of your dance grounds? Well, that is our ceremonial fire. And it is lit at the beginning of the ceremony by our medicine man and our chiefs. So they are firekeepers. They are holding that role for our community beginning the ceremony. We also see fires more intimately, particularly around times of death, as she mentioned. In our community, when a loved one passes on, the first thing the family will do is start a fire. And that fire burns until we send that loved one home. And so we're keeping their spirit company during that time. That fire is never supposed to go out. So those who are firekeepers for that family, they're tasked with making sure that it stays running night and day, keeping it company at all time, and keeping that person's spirit company. And it's a really beautiful time of healing because family members can gather together, friends and relatives can have time to travel, and you come and you visit around that fire. You share memories, you share stories. It's a beautiful healing time. If that is what you need when you lose a loved one. I'm an introvert. I needed quiet and alone time. But for others, it's that sense of community around you. So even if you're not at the fire with your family members, knowing that it's being held for your loved one, that it's there and that they are carrying prayers for you, that's what I think of when I think of fires. We always have fires going in our community. Is this a New England thing? Everybody's got fires in their backyards like all the time. That's very common. We see that all the time. Not so in other places. There are fire warnings. They have rules about such things. So it is a culture shock to other people when they come to New England and they see this. But I think we have long, strong connections to these spaces where we commune together, not just as Native people, but community-wide. We have these sharing times at our fires, in our backyards. They are really a good point of gathering for good spaces. That's what comes to mind when I think of firekeepers. The 4 directions. Now, there's no particular page for this, because if you noticed, and if you didn't, this book is broken up into 4 parts. She breaks it up into the 4 directions, and she starts with the east. If you look back, because you didn't notice, go ahead and check in there. She starts in the east, and that's on purpose. In our communities, things start in the east. That's where the sun rises. That's where the sun comes up. Everything begins, day begins. So everything in relation to the 4 directions, when we teach around the 4 directions, it's the start of things. It's the beginning of life. It's springtime, the re-emerging of plants and flora to our area, births of fauna, everything is coming back, everything is coming alive. It's the start of things, and it happens in the east. Those directions move to the south. The south for our communities, particularly here in New England, there's a real strong, I don't want to say super important, but in our traditional teachings, Creator's home, Katantuit, his home is in the southwest, and it's from that place that all good things came to us. Crow brought from the gardens of Creator the corn and bean that filled our gardens with the squash and creates this perfect synergy of food source that even if you don't have other food resources, corn, bean, and squash give you everything your body needs to survive. Boring, if that's all you had to eat, but it could sustain you. And those gifts came to us from the Southwest, from Creator's gardens. When we leave this earth, we return to his home in the Southwest. So when we think of southern winds, it's the warmth from that area, it's everything that it makes you think of summer. So we're moving from the east and spring, where our year starts, down into summer. And that warmth, that growing time, these are your teenage years, like Donis in the book. She is growing up into her womanhood. Then we move into the west. West, it's where the sun sets. It's where things are beginning to come to a close. That sounds so depressing when I say, oh, adults. Adults in that period of our life. No, we're not quite coming to a close. But you're in your years of growing up. This is, fall. We're moving, whether we love it or not. We are moving closer to the end of our journey on this earth, as with fall and the plants are starting to prepare for leaving in their time of renewal. Back to the north, and this is our northern, it's cold, winter time. It's when things end. In winter, it's not a sad time of loss, it's a transition period. The snow comes, it covers everything. It allows for rest and regrowth and new life to come out of it. So that is where her story ends. It's coming to a close, but it's not over. The story isn't over. And if you didn't know, neither is this story. She has written a second book, is writing a second book. It will come out. She did give us a few teasers, so I'm really intrigued to get into this story. Things don't end just because you're at the end of a circle. A circle is continuous, it continues. We just move into a different phase at that point. So I love that this author kind of set this up with those teachings in mind and had the flow of the book go in that way with the thought that the story's not over, it's continuing. So these teachings are something that we have in our communities that we learn too. It is a part of the medicine when we do healing methods. It reminds us to think holistically of all parts. So these 4 direction teachings also relate to health and wellness. So we engage with these 4 directions often as we're growing up in all of these different arenas. Another thing that has no page, because you can't pick one page in this book that talks about traditional ecological knowledge. It's interwoven through the whole story. What I love about Donis, the character, is her desire to weave her traditional ecological knowledge into science. That is what she's looking to study. That is how she does her investigation in this book, weaving these two teachings together. Science is very valid, but so is our traditional teachings. It helps us to understand even deeper the things that we learn and study in science. A personal connection I had with this story was right off the beginning when I open up the page and I am introduced to Donis. Donis is daughter. In our language, Narragansett, Taunis is daughter. And my niece's name is Natonis. And so I immediately pictured my teenage niece in this role. And my niece is also studying science. She's studying at the University of Rhode Island to become a marine biologist. And her goal as well was to weave traditional teachings into that science and be able to bring that back to the community and grow access for us in that community, in our community. That's where the similarities ended with my niece and Donis. My niece is very shy. She's a beautiful young lady. She's all full of hearts and love and silence. And Donis is just very straightforward. She's a great character, a lot of life in her. But I loved that connection that these young people have, because it's something new that's really being birthed out of this generation. It's a taking back of our traditional ways and putting them back in the forefront. You can learn science, we can go to school, there's lots we can pick up from there and should, but that's not the only place we can learn things, and it's not the only things that matter. And so these young people are really spearheading a movement to get back to our traditions and interweave them into all of the things that we practice and the way we practice it, and making sure that it comes back to the forefront and is giving it the respect that it deserves. So I love the way this book kind of introduces people who may not be aware of traditional ecological knowledge, how you engage with that. Where do these teachings come from? Where are they coming from? Our elders in the book, the time we spend with those who have grown up and learned these ways and have experienced so much more and have deeper connections, and they pass those teachings on to us. And so we have to share those connections. We now have the ability to not only pass them on orally, which is important because I think that oral tradition of sharing helps us to engage deeper instead of just putting it on paper and then it sits there. Wonderful to put on paper. I work at a museum. We document everything. It's always going to be there. But for it to become alive and become useful, we need to engage with it. And that's where oral history is still so important with that engagement piece. So it's really bringing more, what's the word I'm looking for? Respect, I guess. That's a lame kind of word. That's all I could come up with for these traditional teachings. So let's talk enrollment status, because it comes up in this book a lot. And living in an Indigenous community, we hear about enrollment and issues with enrollment all the time because it's something we live with. And what I find for the rest of the world is nobody even knows what that means. Nobody has to engage and deal with that on the regular. And so it is important to understand what we're talking about when we talk about enrollment status. Especially if you're reading this book, it comes up a couple of times. So what do we got? Page 236. When Donna says, I have wanted this, she's talking about being able to apply for her tribal enrollment. So she's been growing up in her community, but she has not been an enrolled citizen. And it's something that she said, she's been dreaming of this. I've wanted this ever since I understood that being Anishinaabe and being an enrolled citizen weren't necessarily the same thing. My mind races, remembering Granny's unsuccessful efforts to get this for Lily. I can become a member, except it changes nothing about me. I am Anishinaabe. Since my first breath, even before, when my new spirit traveled here, I will be Anishinaabe even when my heart stops beating and I journey to the next world. Her identity is not determined by her enrollment status. And I think that's what people get confused around enrollment. Enrollment status is governmental, it's structure. It's like any nation, it's your citizenship. Tribal entities are sovereign nations that have government-to-government relationships with the United States. There are agreements between these two nations in place, and like any sovereign nation in this world, they own the citizenship of their community. You can't go to Italy and demand citizenship. There are rules, there are structures to that. It doesn't mean you're not of Italian descent, doesn't mean you may not be full-blooded Italian. It's not connected to identity, it's connected to citizenship in that nation. And the federal government has made clear that tribal communities have the right to determine who is deemed a citizen of their nation. Is it a perfect system? No. We have to work within these guidelines, but it is our own call as tribal governments to be able to put guidelines around that. So every tribe is different, how they determine membership, what it takes to become an enrolled member of that community. And a lot of that, for some tribes, it can be blood quantum. For some tribes, it has to be engagement in community. Your community has to, what's the word I'm looking for? We always say, we know who our people are. That's the way we talk about it. We know who our people are. So if your community, who claims you? If your community claims you, you're a part of that community. You don't have to be enrolled to have that be a part of your identity. If you're born of a certain family and you are raised within a certain culture, you are still that person. It is still a part of who you are. There are even individuals who have lived and grown up in our communities, have learned our ways, grown up in our community, and we see them as one of our own. Their identity is built on their experiences, the community around them. This is the culture you grow up in. That's different from citizenship. Citizenship is legal status. It gives you voting rights within a tribal community, but you can still be an Indigenous person without being enrolled. Now, does that leave some people disconnected from their community? Legally, yes. If you want to be an active member of that community, then you would seek enrollment, but you do have to follow the guidelines for your tribe, and every tribe does differ what their guidelines will be. So in this story, Daunis is saying she gets to the point where she realizes whether she's enrolled or not, she's Anishinaabe. That doesn't matter. But this is something that gives her a different connection to her community, that brings her in as a citizen, which also means you have a responsibility to your community. So you now have voting rights, you should know what's going on with your community, and you should give back to your community. So that is where this young lady is at this point in the book. And then later on page 243, it talks a little bit about that sovereignty. Each tribe has the sovereign right to determine who's a member. My best friend couldn't get enrolled because of the way Sugar Island Ojibwe Tribe's Enrollment Office calculated Indian blood quantums, fractions of Indian blood based on lineage. And it talks about Granny June and her first husband. He was First Nations from Canada. And because of that, Lily, her granddaughter, did not meet the blood quantum for American Ojibwe in order to enroll. It feels unfair. Is it unfair? Yeah. But it's not our call. These are tribal governments that make these calls for the reasons that they do. And I'm sure they have their reasons for why they have enrollment that way, because also in Canada, they have different enrollment guidelines. So tribes on that side, even though they are relatives, these are imperfect systems because they're not our systems. They're not our systems culturally. But they are something that we have to work within. And in some cases, they do protect tribes from individuals who do not have connections by blood, but portray themselves as Indigenous people. And they want to speak on behalf of Indigenous nations. And so this helps us to determine and have a way of determining who can influence our government structures in our tribal communities. So tribes have the right to determine that. Imperfect systems, absolutely. Do people become disenfranchised because of these systems? Yes, they do. But there are other things to note. If you are an Indigenous person and you are not eligible for enrollment in your tribal community, if you have Indian blood, because they keep track of these things like pedigrees of animals, and it's really disgusting in a way, but it is what this federal government has done. If you have documentation of your family's enrollment, you can apply to the federal government for a certificate of Indian blood so that you are still recognized as a Native person, and that makes you eligible for things like Indian health services, scholarships. There's not a lot of stuff we're getting. People also think that Native communities are getting all these benefits from being Native people. It's not so. But those things that are there and available to us by treaty, agreed to by the federal government with our governments, you can still benefit from them even if you are not enrolled. That is where your certificate of Indian blood comes from. And there's also a lot of tribes that recognize descendancy. So even if you are not enrolled, if your parents and grandparents are, you can still get services in many areas. So it's not a total disenfranchisement of people. And it also doesn't take away who you are. Your family is still your family. Your community still claims you, just as Daunis was claimed by every one of those elders who spoke for her. They claimed her, they taught her, she was there to learn from them well before she ever got enrollment. So that's why enrollment is not as important as identity and your connection to community, which I think is what Angeline was really speaking to in this book when she speaks about identity. Another topic that comes up, colorism. Skin tones. Right off the bat, the author jumps into this because it's hugely prevalent within tribal communities and outside of our communities. On what page is this? 13? Where are we at? Lily has been my best friend since 6th grade. When she came to live with Granny June, we looked like opposites, and not just because of our height difference. I am so pale, the other Nish kids call me Ghost, and I once overheard someone refer to me as that washed-out sister of Levi's. When Lily lived with her Zaganash dad and his wife, they kept her out of the sun so her reddish-brown skin wouldn't get any darker. We both learned early on that there is an acceptable Anishinaabe skin tone continuum, and those who land on its outer edges have to put up with the different versions of the same BS. I won't say the word. You guys are recording this, so let me leave that part out. Colorism is very real within Native communities, and it's not something that existed pre-contact. Your color, your skin tone did not matter within our communities, and people come in all shapes and colors and sizes. In this photo, this is all Narragansett children at a summer camp we did. They're all cousins, relatives. They're all the same family. They come in every size, shape, and color. That is not what makes them who they are. You cannot determine somebody's lineage because that's not how DNA works. You can come out looking like many different things. I have 2 sons with my husband, and one is very light-skinned, the other is very dark-skinned. They are full siblings. It's just the way that things came together in that little chain of DNA. But they are who they are, regardless of how they look on the outside. So when we're fixing skin tones, it's really built out of all of the stereotypes that we've grown up with, what we expect Native people to look like. And those have been put on us by media representation of Native people since the very beginning. We live in a colorist society, and colonial New England, slavery in the southern states, slavery in New England, because let's not forget it was there too. It dictated your status in life. They literally made categories for people based on how dark they were. It's discussing those words we don't even like to use anymore, but they're literally categories on boxes related to race that you would check based on how ethnically mixed you were, how light or dark your skin was. You could get, in our area, particularly in New England, when they stopped identifying people as Native after detribalization in the 1880s, they started to categorize you either as colored or white. And it depended on what you looked like when you came out based on your skin tone, regardless of your family. My grandmother had 12 children. Some of them are white, some of them were colored based on this scale that was used. So skin tones mean absolutely nothing, but we grow up seeing and hearing and having that influence how we are perceived by others, and then how we perceive ourselves, because that's what happens when something gets thrown at you so often. It becomes internalized, and then it becomes a lateral attack against other community members to fit in the right place and getting called out when you're not. So it's something that we see and hear about, particularly in areas like New England, where we are very ethnically diverse as Indigenous people. We are the story of colonialism at its very beginning in all of the history of this land. When I look at myself in the mirror, I see every mix of everything that came through Rhode Island, and I have no idea what I am. I've only ever known one community, my Narragansett community that I grew up in, because both of my parents were enrolled members, my grandparents, and I didn't know my great-grandparents. And beyond that, I have no idea, because genealogy in Native communities are very difficult. Do I know I have African-American blood? Absolutely. I suspect Portuguese, particularly in my area, but I don't know that for sure. I've heard family stories of Jewish blood. I've heard an English woman. Where and when? Where was my connection to that? I didn't grow up in that community. And yet, based on how I look and where I'm at, people feel it's okay to question who and what you are, to ask you how much. And we're used to hearing people who are biracial and, your mom's one race, your dad's another. But what about those of us that are this mix of New England and we don't know? And you want us to divvy ourselves up? And what is the purpose in that? Because we're looking for how much Indigenous are you, because that makes you have more of a claim on that than someone who is more ethnically diverse. It doesn't work like that in our communities, because it's not based off of skin tone, it's based off of cultural and community connection. I live and grew up right on our reservation, as close as you can get to it, in Narragansett community. We don't live on our traditional lands for a number of reasons. That's a whole nother presentation. But my family's homestead's literally right on the side of it. It was my backyard growing up. And that's where my parents grew up. My mom's family was on one side. My dad's family bought the land on the other. So I had grandparents on both sides. You could cross the reservation to get to each family. So many of my relatives and community members grew up connected to this land and space, but we live in New England, and we are all over the state of Rhode Island, and there's other communities that came and settled here, and we intermixed with them and brought them into our community. So people identify based on who they are, their connections, their family stories, the communities they grew up with, not based on skin tones and intermixtures. So we need to get those things out of our heads when we look at Indigenous people and we talk about identity and stereotypes, which is what this author speaks to quite a bit in this book. I picked just a few pages. Page 55, we will start with, because this is where Indigenous is speaking with Jamie around her frustration around identity. And she says, I think I got this in my way. It's hard when being Native means different things depending on who's asking and why. That's what Jamie says. And to some people, you'll never be Native enough, I add. Yeah, it's your identity, but it gets defined or controlled by other people. His words mirror my exact thoughts. And then she goes on to talk about who made decisions for who and what she was going to be, how she identified. And in her family, because they didn't want to acknowledge the Native connection, they did not enroll her. They raised her in a French community. And so she had to reach out to her Indigenous community to stay connected there because of her own desires for that connection. So there's other people who can control your identity, is the idea. And we see that a lot, and we see that a lot in our children, in our school systems, especially those of us who are ethnically mixed. And people want to put labels on who you are and question your identity when they say, I'm Narragansett, I'm Pequot, I'm Mohegan, I'm Schaghticoke, I'm Nipmuc, I'm Wampanoag. We are those things. That's the community we grew up with, regardless of whether I'm fitting your stereotype or not. On page 210, this was my favorite little game, Bigotry Bingo, in the book. When Lily and I were on Tribal Youth Council, we all played a game called Bigotry Bingo. When we heard a comment that fed into stereotypes, we'd call it out. Dream catchers were the free space, too easy. There were so many others. You don't look Native. Must be nice to get free college. Can you give me an Indian name for my dog? And then she goes on talking about Megan's tattoo. Megan's talking about that it's sexy. And then she says, Megan, about her tattoo, I'm honoring Indians, she says in response to my lingering scowl. Plus I'm part Indian, so it's okay. My great-grandma was an Indian princess. Lily, we have a winner. Bingo, I whisper as I leave the bathroom. Indigenous people have heard all of these things over and over again. The idea that we have relatives in our background that are of Indigenous descent, many times people don't know what communities they come from, or they always come from the same couple of tribes that are very large and well known, but can't really tell you how that connection works in, and have no real connection, but then they use that to say that they can speak for that community, despite the fact that they have no real connection. That's problematic in our community, to have others who don't really grow up and understand your experience then speaking on behalf of your community. On page 310, this was when the teacher was speaking to her, and she says, once your mother is feeling better, I hope you rethink staying home. I know Indian kids struggle in college because they're not prepared academically or socially, but Donis, you're not like them. Words truly do fail me. All I can do is gape at her in disbelief. Well, I don't mean anything bad about Indians, Mrs. Hammond looks around anxiously. You know, I'm not prejudiced. We've all had those experiences, these microaggressions that get thrown on you. When you're a successful Native, when you're someone who's intelligent, when you're someone who is thriving and surviving, and you get seen as a credit to your race, an exception instead of the norm. And those stereotypes are built off of seeing Indigenous people as failures, and you are outside of what they expect because we've been flooded with images of Indigenous poverty, reservations where people are struggling. Are those issues real? Absolutely, but they don't define us, and they don't define everyone within our communities. We are walking into worlds a lot of times. That theme comes through in this book over and over again. You have Donis, who's kind of between these two worlds, her French side and her Indigenous side, and how those two go head to head so often, trying to survive and figure out who you are and what you want to be as you go forward. I'm not going to talk about powwow because I talked way too much already. Powwow connectors, a couple of pages that speak to powwow. But the only thing that I wanted to bring up in this book, because I felt like some Native people did not particularly agree, but I think you have to understand where she's coming from. On page 479, when she says, powwows are not ceremonies, And yet there is something restorative about gathering of our community, the collective spirit of our tribal nation coming together, sharing songs and fellowships with others. It's our annual powwow, the third weekend of August, and my community needs healing now more than ever. She speaks about powwows not being ceremony, and I think a lot of Native people would differ in how they define powwows and saying they are ceremony. I don't think she's wrong in her interpretation. What she is saying is that these powwows and the way we engage in them now are very different from our traditional ceremonies. We do have ceremony outside of powwow, but powwow is a more modern construction built off of those ceremonies. And certainly ceremony is happening all throughout the time that you are at this event. There's ceremony all around you. The dances themselves are a part of ceremony. You are praying for family members, relatives, loved ones when you are dancing. There's ceremony that goes into the preparations before dances begin. There's ceremonies happening behind the scenes with drum groups, with new children being inducted into the circle. There's so much ceremony happening around you. But powwows are very modern. When I talk about them at museum, I say if our ancestors came back and went to one of our powwows, they'd be like, what the heck are you guys doing? Because they have evolved over time and because they have expanded in the interconnections of many different tribal communities, sharing unique ceremonial practices together. So everything changes because of that. So there's a distinction that some may not consider powwow ceremony because we have very different, distinct ceremonies for each unique tribe, but in a way, they are still ceremony in and of themselves, just kind of a newer creation around ceremony. That's all I had to say about that, really. I was gonna be very long-winded about it. We condensed. Boarding school experiences. She speaks to this on page 100 when Granny June talks about her family's experiences. And I don't think there's a single Native person in North America who hasn't been touched by these experiences. We are not, as New England Native people, as directly connected in Southern New England to these experiences. However, I say that because the numbers were much less, but not none. We did have Native children from the Narragansett, Wampanoag tribal communities and others that were sent to Carlisle Indian School, but much less than other tribal communities. Because these practices had already been happening in our communities in New England for hundreds of years before the General Parat started the Carlisle Indian School. From the time of colonization, indentured servitude in our region took Native children, sometimes as young as 10 months old, and placed them with white families, forcibly removing them from their families and communities and having them raised until they came to adulthood, and sometimes beyond that, by non-Native people. We were already experiencing these displacements and disconnections way longer. They continued with the industrial schools in our region, where they removed children from homes and put them into industrial schools, and they continued through foster care systems, which is still an issue today in Native communities, as Native children are still removed from families more than any other nationality of children. So this taking of children, we understand and have felt the effects of being removed and disconnected from our families and communities. But as Indigenous people, we have also intermarried with Native people all throughout the United States. And you'd be hard-pressed to find a family that does not have a relative through those marriages who have direct boarding school stories that now that has become a part of your family history through your children and your grandchildren. And that legacy passes on. So we are all very interconnected to these tales of loss and disconnection and the need to heal from that really difficult experience. Lastly, justice, issues of justice. Page 486, she's talking, they're talking about the FBI. I was kind of grossed out by this when I was reading this. When Ron talks about They know I work for the FBI. My sister thinks it's dangerous. My cousin thinks I'm a sellout. I do this work because we need good people working at the agencies that help tribes. Auntie snorts, scariest words ever spoken. I'm from the federal government and I'm here to help. It's true, there's a lot of not trusting of our governmental systems around justice and law enforcement because we've had bad experiences with them in our communities. In this book, when the way that the investigation played out goes on into the next page. It was a federal investigation, and they kept the tribe out of it because they didn't trust tribes to be able to govern themselves and do so judiciously and fairly. So they led this investigation around the tribal government and their own policing. That's not a good maker of relationship, regardless of if the agents in the investigation were from other Native tribes. We have seen time and time again in our communities a lack of justice happening for our communities, which makes you not trust. I can't get into all of the details, but because, God, long stories, but this photo here comes from the smoke shop in Rhode Island, the Narragansett tribe. When they opened a smoke shop, there are tax-free smoke shops on Indian reservations all over the country. When the Narragansett tribe did it, they brought in a SWAT team to close it down. They said they hadn't done a raid that violent since they had raided this huge drug operation up in Providence. So they brought in force, they came in number, and it was very violent. This is my cousin. She was pregnant at the time, and they literally were kneeling on her back on the ground. This went to court, this played out in the courts. A lot of the federal officers, tribal officers are considered federal officers. They were arrested by state officers. They went to courts. This did not play out in favor for our tribal community. And there are those who did have, what's the word I'm looking for? The cases went against them, so they have things on their record because they were defending their right to have a business on their reservation and to govern it as all other tribes do around this country. And yet we had no justice from how this played out. Whole great long story, but it makes you really question the way the federal government does things. This photograph of the athlete here, this is Ellison Tarzan Brown. He was a great uncle, my grandmother's brother. He's well known for having won the Boston Marathon twice, 1936 and 1939. He was an exceptional athlete. He was murdered. He had gotten into a fight at a bar with a gentleman. It was very public. They left the bar. The person he was fighting him ran him over, and he was found not guilty. It was just an accident. So despite the fact that they had just been fighting very publicly, he made threats against his life, carried those threats out, and he ended up dead. Nothing was done to that individual. And this feels like a long time ago. It happened again in the late 90s to Melvin Coombs, a Wampanoag tribal member, when he got into an argument. He was found dead on the land of the person. His body, they had removed and hidden, and it was on the person's land. He got off completely with no charges whatsoever. And it was disgusting when you read that case and the attitude that the judge even had, like, why did this even come before me? Totally ignoring all of the evidence. So there is an understanding that we don't often get justice. And even when we do win, there's small wins, and they come at a great price. When the Narragansett tribe was approved for free beach access for tribal members, it only came after the most disgusting and racist town meeting that anybody has ever been to, where they said the worst things about our community members. And it only gave us access for 1 year. Trying it out, see what happens. So when we talk about issues of justice, we have known far too long that justice does not always play in our favor. I'm gonna skip 7 generation teachings because that's a long one too. our beloved elders that she speaks to, the benefit of them. But I want to end with this quote on page 485, so I think it brings it all together. Let's leave on something positive. When she said, "I am overcome with a mixture of emotions, sad that their innocent eyes," talking about Native children and her family, "sad that their innocent eyes are open to the trauma that still impacts our community today. Angry, they must learn these truths to be strong Anishinaabe in a world where Indians are thought of only in the past tense. But proud that they, smart, sturdy, and loved, are the greatest wish our ancestors had for our nation to survive and flourish." And I think as much as Indigenous stories can be stories of resilience and survivance and trauma, there's also success. We are still here, we are still positive. We have a beautiful burgeoning community that is ever growing, and these young people are doing amazing things. Our stories are getting told with proper representation, and now we have this one book that has so many things in it. I'm going over my time trying to touch on them all, because this author wanted to get the chance to say all the things that we have not always had the opportunity to say and put them out there for people to start discussing. So far too much to discuss, but I welcome any questions that you have. And if anybody wants to talk more, we could go on forever elsewhere.
I would be fine with that. Keep talking.
There's a lot of talking that could be done. This was too much. There was a lot in this book.
Silvermoon, thank you so much for coming in to
Thank you for having me.
This little nugget. I mean, I feel like we could be going on forever, and like I said, I would be fine with that. Does anybody have any questions here in the room? Please come to the microphone so that everyone can hear you.
I was wondering if there's an educational system in the Indian nations, like high school or college or something like that.
So what's happening for Indigenous education in high schools and colleges? Yeah. For Natives or for everybody?
For people who identify.
So people who identify as Indigenous. So federal government does give monies to tribal communities for education. They are limited dollars that have to stretch a long way. So they do have programs across Native communities like the Johnson O'Malley program that does educational opportunities, sometimes work experiences, learning experiences, and tutoring programs for tribal kids out of those federal dollars. Tribes have limited amount of money for scholarship opportunities, for secondary education. But just like any young person, we have to apply for scholarships, we have to apply for those Pell Grants. We've got to keep up good grades to earn those scholarships to get through school. There's a lot of challenges in education for Native people. And what we see in the numbers is they're not terrible numbers. I don't want to act like Native people are not graduating. They are graduating. They are just graduating at less of a rate than other nationalities, and have a really difficult time finishing college because of expense, because of the need to leave your community in order to attend those places and being disconnected during those times. It makes for real challenges for Native young people to finish school. So there's still a lot of supports needed in that area. There are things happening to help bridge the gap, but not enough is being done, because once you get them to college, we really need to do the work of keeping them there and supporting them so that they can finish. Sorry. So the thing is, Native people are everywhere. That's one of the big challenges. You can't just target them at one school district in one place because we don't all live in one community. In the state of Rhode Island, we are so spread out in that state. We're in every school district. It makes it really super difficult to target all of those children and make sure all of the resources are coming to them, which is why we need each school district to be doing the work of learning what's out there in supports for Native kids and bringing it to those students where they're at, as opposed to trying to have one big overarching space, because Native kids are spread out everywhere.
Good evening. Thank you so much for your storytelling and your testimony this evening. I'm struck by your observation at the very beginning about land acknowledgement being a story, and we contemplate what part we play in that story. And I'm curious if you have any examples of places where you have observed non-Native communities taking a next step beyond the land acknowledgement in ways that you find to be effective and impactful in terms of allyship.
Absolutely. So land acknowledgements are becoming the next big thing. Everybody's throwing a land acknowledgement on everything and thinking they've done something. When we work with organizations that want to build a land acknowledgement, we always start, we do a whole workshop. The whole goal is around developing a plan for implementing ways that you can engage and support Native communities before you write a single word that you're going to say for your land acknowledgement. Because the goal is not just to say you're on Native land, it's to really speak to how are you supporting tribal communities? How are you engaging with them? How are you uplifting Indigenous voice? So for each unique organization, what do you do as an organization? What do you provide to the community? How can you utilize your resources, your place in the community, the connections that you have to support Native people? And then come up with an action-oriented plan with steps that you are going to take, programs you are going to implement in order to support Native communities. Once you've done all of that, and you start engaging with Native people to build those relationships, now you can write a land acknowledgement that reflects that work. So it's really the last thing that you should be doing is putting together a land acknowledgement. So some of the organizations that I've done that with, Community Music Works in Providence, we had a lovely time of sharing together. They wanted to write a land acknowledgement. When we dug into how they can build a plan that backs that up, they said, we got to do this first. And they immediately started looking at their programs, ways that they could create scholarships for Native students to learn music. Are there musicians in the community we can be working with and bringing in? They're so focused in what they're going to do, they haven't finished their land acknowledgement, because that's not what's important. Those are just words if they're not followed up with actually actions. So they're a wonderful organization doing that work. The University of Rhode Island, they did all the work for us. They're supporting our organization very strongly. We are building a new museum, if you are not aware, that will be on 18 acres. That is on the URI campus, even though we'll still be our own separate nonprofit. They are supporting all of our efforts in getting that going, supporting us financially, bringing us into classrooms. We do so many programs with all of the different teachers there. And they created a scholarship for all Narragansett students to be able to attend tuition-free and have $2,500 to support their learning while they're there each semester. So that is doing something before you write a land acknowledgement to say we're on Narragansett land. That's what it should look like.
Hi, thank you so much. This was enlightening and beautiful.
Thank you.
Are you familiar with the firewater exhibit in Providence?
I have not seen that, no.
I just wondered if there was any connection because it's tending fires, you know, and it's near that land, right?
Yeah, where is it at in Providence?
It's
Do you know?
the river that they rerouted it through the city, and
I think like, what's that, water fire?
yeah.
The water fire event.
Yes,
Okay, so water fire, have you ever been?
yes.
They have started, they've started to engage different community organizations into that event. Tomaquag has had the benefit of being at Waterfire, setting up stands so you can kind of engage. They did have some performances from Native community members at that event. So yes, it is, it's something that's broadening as it continues. 'Cause it's been a number of years now that it's been growing.
Yeah, I just wondered
So
if there was any
when you
connection.
said fire water,
Yeah, sorry.
I'm picturing who's
Right.
doing exhibits about alcohol somewhere. Sorry.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for what you have shared with us tonight. I come from a family that has lived here since the 1600s. And I was coming mainly because I'd like to know how we can, as individuals, make some sort of understanding, and where can we go to get the information to help us acknowledge our debt to the previous inhabitants.
Yeah, great question. So I'm a history buff. I've always loved a museum. I've always loved reading history books. I'm always encouraging everybody to read everything. Dig into books. When you are looking to learn more about Indigenous people, reading what they have to say, because so often we've heard every other perspective. That's what we grow up learning in school. So taking the time to look specifically for Indigenous authors, Indigenous researchers, and hearing their perspectives on these points in history. There are not a ton of published Indigenous educators in the New England region that represent our tribal communities. So that can become difficult in our area, but there are many researchers that work and engage with many Native communities and are helping to uplift Indigenous voice into their research. So there's some really great researchers like Jason Mancini who have been engaged with our community for a very long time, done a lot of research around our communities and included our voice into his work. There's, God, I'm the worst with names. I'm looking at her face and can't come up with her name. Oh, and I'm looking at the cover of her book and can't come up with the title. There's some other really good ones. I'm sorry, you can reach out to me by email from our website for all of the names of things I can't remember. But looking into the research yourself, reading those works, I think that's the best place to start. Visiting Indigenous-led museums, we have quite a number of them throughout Southern New England. Here in Connecticut, you have the Pequot Museum, great educators there that you can engage and learn from. There's also, in Rhode Island, the Mashantucket Museum, Tomaquag Museum. But the Half-and-Refer Museum also has a Narragansett woman who is working there. Her name is Leah Hopkins that you can engage with. She's put out some educational pieces on their website so you can hear directly from an Indigenous Narragansett native on cultural perspectives. So that museum, they have a really great collection that features a lot of New England tribal communities' history and belongings. The Mashpee Museum over on the Cape is Indigenous-led, and the Aquinnah Cultural Center. Those are just a few in our Southern New England region that are truly Indigenous-led organizations. So you can take a little day trip, go and visit some of these, engage with those community members, but really getting to know your community members. The more you attend tribal functions, many of which are public facing and open to public, it gives you an opportunity to learn from them directly, make a friend, engage, get to know, really, it's not just all about history because we're here living now, what's happening in our communities now, listening to Indigenous-led podcasts that talk about issues that are going on in our communities right now. It's a great way to get a first-person voice on a lot of those issues where we're limited to the arenas that we have to kind of broadly publicize issues in Indian country. Podcasts are allowing us that platform without people changing what you say before it goes out. So there's a lot of really great ones. On our website, we have our education page, and it has a link for educational resources, and I list a number of some of my favorite podcasts there, one of which is led by a local Mashantucket tribal member, so if you want some local connections there, he's a really good one to listen to, Michael Kicking Bear. He used to work at Tomaquag Museum. We miss him very much. We love Mike.
Great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you.
I'd like to remind everybody that we still have copies. Oh, do we have one more? Sorry, we have one more
Still
question.
good?
Thank you. I'd like to echo my thanks as well. And so you already touched upon this, but across state lines, like you were just sort of alluding and pointing out, what role does Rhode Island, for example, play with Connecticut and vice versa, either our governments and or the tribes themselves? And you mentioned Mashantucket and the Pequot Museum and ways in which we can engage, but what about what roles, like do the state borders? I just don't know enough about that. I would love for you to give us an idea. Living down here in Connecticut, are there ways that, those lines are kind of blurred and people are working together?
So states working together to support Native communities?
Or with efforts that aren't necessarily just in Rhode Island and sort of governed by what's happening in Rhode Island or in Connecticut. Are there joint efforts? Because tribes, go across state lines. So how does that translate? Or does it translate with action?
Difficult question to answer, for sure. I think we think of state governments, state governments are very much focused around their state. They are the leadership and governing body of their unique state. And each state government has its own relationship with tribal communities and the tribal communities they recognize. So it's different state to state. Are these states working together on different initiatives? Yes. Do we see Native communities factoring in that in a good way often? Not necessarily. State governments, there's budgets in place, there's goals that they're trying to reach. Some states are doing better than others with how they interact with tribal governments. I am not a political person. I don't like to speak to the politics in each state. In the state of Rhode Island, the Narragansett tribe has had a very tenuous relationship with our state government. There's been a lot of generations of hurt and things that are still playing out, still in court systems now, where they're fighting against every effort that the tribe has to self-govern and to create economic opportunities and to support its tribal members. So there's different people within the state that have been allies, and there's others that have not. So when we look at now, are they working with other states to benefit tribes? I'm feeling like I want to say not really, because we're struggling right there within our own state. Never mind bringing in others to be a part of that party. So really, it's very, the states are very specific to the tribal bodies within them and those relationships there that are state government to tribal government relationships. There's not so much of a need for tribes in Massachusetts or Connecticut to be collaborating with state governments in other states around those efforts. It just doesn't kind of work that way. And really, state governments, it's even different there from federal governments, because that's a whole different layer of relationship that happens. So the politics around tribes is really It's a lot. But why is it important to know? Because we are sovereign nations living within this nation. And it's different from other ethnic groups because we have treaty agreements. These are government-to-government agreements in place of, just like the United States has treaty agreements with other nations all over the world. It's the same here. So we're not like every other minority group, ethnic group in this country because we actually have governmental systems that are interacting with your federal government. So as citizens, you should know what those agreements are. You should know how it's playing out in our court systems, and your voice can very much become an ally because who you vote in as leaders definitely impacts judgments for tribal communities as we fight through all of these very messy legal finaglings that happen. So becoming better versed on those issues that are within our court systems that are facing tribal governments, 'cause there's a lot of really important ones going on right now. Read about ICWA. That's one you definitely want to catch up on because the cases being fought against ICWA, the Indian Child Welfare Act, are actually attacks on sovereignty of tribal governments. So it's way bigger than that in the way it's playing out. These are things that in another 10 years or so, we may see very different relationships between the federal government and tribes as a new Supreme Court is making really important decisions on tribal sovereignty right now. So I'll leave it at that. That's just a little touch of things that are way too big for me.
Okay, before I get started again, any other questions?
You know where to
Okay.
find me if you have
Yes.
more.
Definitely reach out to Silvermoon if you have any further questions. And if you haven't yet read The Firekeeper's Daughter, please do. We have many copies here for you to take out. And Angeline will be here next Thursday to talk to you again. So thank you all for coming. Silvermoon, thank you
Thank
so
you
much for
having
coming
me.
tonight.
Appreciate it. Definitely recommend coming and hearing Angeline speak. She's a wonderful public speaker. She's a lovely person and has quite a great sense of humor. So I think you'll really enjoy that presentation.